Tonight we come to Rome at the height of its power, the marble capital of the world, a city of 1 million people, temples and palaces gleaming on its hills, the center of an empire that stretches from Britain to the deserts of the East. It is a magnificent place, and it is rotting from the top, because the man who rules it all is sliding, year by year, from a promising young prince into something close to a monster. His name is Nero. He will become one of the most infamous rulers in all of history, the emperor remembered for cruelty and vanity and madness. The man, they say, played music while his city burned, who murdered his own mother, who fancied himself the greatest artist alive, while his empire curdled with fear around him. The truth of him is more complicated and more interesting than the legend, as it always is, and tonight we'll follow the whole arc of it. How a boy raised by one of the most dangerous women in Rome came to absolute power at 16, began well, and then descended, step by bloody step, into the tyranny and paranoia that destroyed him. To understand Nero, you have to begin not with him, but with the woman who made him, because before Nero was a monster, his mother was, and she built his throne on a foundation of poison and murder, and then learned, too late, what she had created. Her name was Agrippina, and she was Roman royalty of the most lethal kind, descended from the first emperor, sister of one mad emperor who came before, and possessed of a ferocious will to power that stopped at nothing. From the time her son was small, she had one consuming ambition, to make him ruler of the world and to rule the world through him. She played the long game with a patience and ruthlessness that would have impressed any general. The throne of Rome was held by her uncle, the Emperor Claudius, an aging, scholarly, much underestimated man, and Agrippina set out to capture it. She married him. The fact that he was her own uncle, that such a marriage was very nearly unthinkable by Roman custom, did not slow her for a moment. She simply had the law adjusted and the objections silenced, and made herself empress at Claudius's side. And once she was there, she went to work removing every obstacle between her son and supreme power. The chief obstacle was Claudius's own son, a boy named Britannicus, the emperor's natural heir, who by every right should have inherited the throne. Agrippina maneuvered relentlessly to push him aside. She persuaded the aging Claudius to adopt her own son as well, and then to favor him, advancing her boy ahead of Britannicus in every way that mattered, positioning him as the heir, while Claudius's true son was sidelined, isolated, and kept from the public eye. By the time she was finished, her son, though younger, stood first in line for the throne, and Claudius's own blood son stood second, forgotten in his own father's house. And then Claudius began to have second thoughts. The old emperor, it was whispered, had started to regret what he had done, to feel he had wronged his own son, and to think of restoring Britannicus to his rightful place. For Agrippina, this was mortal danger. If Claudius lived long enough to change his mind, everything she had built would collapse, and her son would lose the throne to the boy he had displaced. So Agrippina did what people in her family did when someone stood in their way. She had the emperor killed. The story, told and retold ever after, is that she fed him poison hidden in a dish of mushrooms, a delicacy the old man loved, and that Claudius, emperor of Rome, died in agony in the night, murdered by his own wife at his own table to clear the path for her son. And the moment he was dead, Agrippina moved with perfect, practiced speed. She controlled the timing of the announcement, secured the loyalty of the palace guard, and presented her son to the soldiers and the Senate as the new emperor before Britannicus or anyone else could so much as react. The guard hailed him. The Senate confirmed him. And so, through a marriage to her uncle and the murder of her husband, Agrippina placed her teenage son on the throne of the Roman world. He was 16 years old. His name now was Nero Claudius Caesar, 5th emperor of Rome, master of the known world, a boy raised to power over the corpse of the man he called father, by a mother who intended to rule everything through him. And for a little while, it seemed she would. Picture him at the start, a teenager suddenly handed absolute power over 100 million people, an empire, an army, the wealth of the world. He was not, at first, the monster he would become. He was a boy with real gifts and real weaknesses, clever, artistic, hungry for admiration, passionate about music and poetry, and the theater, and the roar of the chariot races, far more interested in applause than in administration. He wanted, above all, to be loved, and to be admired, and to be thought brilliant. In a private man, those are harmless enough vanities. In the absolute ruler of the world, watered by flattery and unchecked by any limit, they would grow into something terrible. But that was still to come. At the beginning, Nero was guided by two capable men who held the worst at bay. His old tutor, the famous philosopher Seneca, one of the great minds of the age, and a tough, honest soldier named Burrus, who commanded the guard. These two steadied the young emperor, managed the empire competently in his name, and reigned in his impulses. And for about 5 years, under their guidance, Rome was reasonably well governed. Taxes were reformed, the courts were fairer, the young emperor made gestures of mercy and moderation, and people dared to hope that this bright, art-loving youth might grow into a good ruler. Later Romans would look back on these first 5 years as the good years of Nero, the promise before the ruin. The trouble was the woman standing behind the throne. Agrippina had murdered her way to power not to hand it to her son, but to wield it herself through him. She expected to be the true ruler of Rome, with Nero as her instrument. And at first, she very nearly was, her face appearing beside his on the coins, her hand in every decision. But Nero was growing up, and a boy who has been handed the power of a god does not stay anyone's instrument for long. The first and most dangerous struggle of Nero's reign would not be against any foreign enemy or rival senator. It would be against his own mother, the woman who had killed for him and who would not let go. And the way that struggle ended would mark the moment the promising young prince first crossed into blood and began the long descent into the monster history remembers. The war between Nero and Agrippina was quiet at first, a struggle of glances and slights and shifting alliances inside the palace, mother and son circling each other for control of the empire. Agrippina expected obedience and gratitude. Nero, growing into his power and chafing under her grip, began to resist her, to overrule her, to push her slowly away from the center of things. And as he pulled away, Agrippina made a threat that would prove fatal to her. She began to suggest, in her anger, that she had made Nero and could unmake him, that there was, after all, another heir, Britannicus, the son of Claudius, the boy she had pushed aside, now growing toward manhood. The implication was unmistakable and chilling. Cross me too far, and I will tear you down and raise up the rightful heir in your place. It was the worst miscalculation of her life. She had taught her son, by her own example, exactly one lesson about how to deal with a rival to the throne, and Nero had learned it well. Britannicus did not live to be used as anyone's weapon. At a grand banquet in the palace, with the imperial family and the great men of Rome reclining at the tables, the boy Britannicus was served a drink. By the careful custom of a court where poison was an ever-present fear, his food and drink were tasted first by a servant to prove them safe, and the drink passed the test. But it had been served too hot, and when Britannicus asked for it to be cooled, cold water was added to the cup, and the poison was in the water, slipped in after the tasting. The boy drank, and within moments he collapsed at the table, convulsing, unable to speak or breathe. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the court Nero ruled. As Britannicus seized and choked and died in front of the assembled company, Nero, reclining calmly, told the alarmed guests not to worry, that it was nothing, merely one of the boy's known fits, that he would recover shortly. And the banquet went on. The guests, taking the cue from the emperor's perfect calm, returned to their food and conversation, while the rightful heir of Rome died on the floor beside them. Britannicus was dead before the meal ended, poisoned in plain sight, and the empire simply carried on as if nothing had happened. Nero had removed his rival exactly as his mother had taught him, and learned, in the doing, how easy it was, and how little anyone would dare to say. Agrippina, watching her son murder the boy she had threatened to raise against him, understood at last what she had unleashed. The weapon she had built had turned in her hand. Her son no longer needed her, no longer feared her, and would no longer be ruled by her. And a woman who knew where all the bodies were buried, who had murdered an emperor and could murder again, was now not an asset to Nero but a threat. The struggle between them curdled into something colder, and Nero began to want what his mother had taught him to want when someone stood in his way. Not her obedience, but her death. But murdering your own mother, the woman who bore you, the empress, beloved by some, watched by all, was a harder and more dangerous thing than poisoning a forgotten boy, and Nero knew it had to look like an accident. What he devised was grotesque in its cleverness. He had a ship built with a hidden flaw, a vessel engineered to come apart at sea, to collapse and sink on command, so that his mother's death would seem the work of the treacherous water and not of her son. He made a show of reconciliation with Agrippina, all warmth and affection, lulling her suspicions, and after a friendly feast, he sent her home by night across the bay in his specially built ship, embracing her fondly as she left. Out on the dark water, the mechanism was triggered, and the ship broke apart and collapsed as designed, the heavy ceiling of the cabin crashing down, the vessel coming to pieces beneath her. And it failed. Agrippina, tough and a strong swimmer, and exactly the survivor you would expect the most dangerous woman in Rome to be, was shielded by chance from the falling wreckage, slipped into the sea, and swam through the dark water to the shore, surviving the elaborate trap entirely. She understood at once, of course, what had happened, that the collapsing ship had been no accident, that her own son had just tried to murder her, and in that knowledge she faced an impossible choice, and chose, desperately, to pretend. She sent word to Nero that she had survived a terrible accident, signaling that she did not suspect him, hoping that feigned ignorance might buy her life. It bought her nothing. Nero, hearing that his mother had survived, and now surely knew the truth, panicked, and then resolved to finish what the sea had failed to do, directly, brutally, dropping all pretense of accident. He sent soldiers to her villa. They came in the night and surrounded her room, and Agrippina understood, finally, that there would be no more pretending, that her son had sent men to kill her in her own home. The accounts of her death carry one last terrible detail that has echoed down the centuries, that as the assassins closed in and raised their weapons, Agrippina bared herself and told them to strike the womb that had carried Nero, as if to say that the part of her most deserving of punishment was the part that had brought such a son into the world. And there they killed her, the empress, the kingmaker, the murderer of an emperor, struck down on the orders of the boy she had killed to crown. Nero had murdered his own mother. It is one of the most infamous acts in all of Roman history, and it marks the true turning point of his reign, the moment the restraints came off for good. He was said to be haunted by it afterward, claiming to be pursued by his mother's ghost, tormented in his sleep. But haunted or not, he had crossed the last line a man can cross, and found that the world did not end, that the Senate sent congratulations, that the flatterers found reasons to praise even this. He had learned, finally and completely, that there was no deed too dark for an emperor to get away with, and a man who believes that, with absolute power and no one left to restrain him, is the most dangerous thing in the world. From here, the descent steepens, into vanity and cruelty, and the long slide of a mind with no limits left into something like madness. With his mother dead and his power absolute, Nero stopped pretending to be the kind of emperor Rome expected and gave himself fully to the thing he had always cared about most, being adored as a great artist. To understand how scandalous this was, you have to understand Roman values. A Roman emperor was supposed to be a soldier, a statesman, a figure of grave dignity above the common entertainments. Performers, actors, singers, musicians, charioteers were considered low, disreputable, barely respectable, however much people enjoyed watching them. For the emperor of Rome, the master of the world, to mount a public stage and sing, to race chariots in front of crowds, to compete for prizes like a common entertainer, was a staggering humiliation of the office, an embarrassment that appalled the old Roman aristocracy to its core. And Nero did it constantly and gloried in it. He sang and played the lyre in public performances, taking the stage himself before audiences, performing long, self-composed pieces and demanding to be judged in competitions, which, unsurprisingly, he always won, the judges being far too wise to hand the emperor anything but first prize. He raced chariots, including in the great games, and was declared the victor even on one famous occasion when he was thrown from his chariot and failed to finish the race at all. He took his act on tour, performing across the empire, collecting thousands of prizes and crowns, utterly convinced of his own genius, surrounded by a claque of admirers paid to applaud rapturously at his every note. And the audiences were not always there by choice. When Nero performed, the doors of the theater were shut and guarded, and no one was permitted to leave until the emperor had finished, and the emperor could perform for hours. People were trapped in their seats through endless recitals, forbidden to show boredom, forced to applaud on cue, watched by informers noting who seemed insufficiently enthralled. The accounts tell of people so desperate to escape the interminable performances that they feigned death to be carried out, or women giving birth in the stands because they could not leave, or men climbing the walls at the back to drop down and flee. To be caught looking bored while the emperor sang could be dangerous. So Rome's leading citizens sat, hour after hour, trapped, exhausted, applauding furiously, while the master of the world warbled and preened on the stage and believed every forced ovation was the genuine love of an adoring public. There is something darkly absurd in it, and something genuinely menacing too, because a ruler who surrounds himself only with forced applause and paid flattery, who punishes the smallest sign of an unwelcome truth, loses, bit by bit, all contact with reality. Nero was building a world around himself made entirely of mirrors and yes-men, a bubble of adoration with no honest voice left in it. And inside that bubble, his sense of himself swelled monstrously while his judgment rotted. He was becoming a man who could no longer tell the difference between love and fear, between genuine acclaim and the desperate applause of trapped and terrified people. His private life darkened in step with his public one. He had been married as a political match to a gentle and well-loved noblewoman named Octavia, the daughter of the Emperor Claudius, a woman the Roman people genuinely cared for. But Nero had fallen for another woman, the beautiful and ambitious Poppaea, and Octavia stood in the way. So he disposed of her with the casual cruelty that now marked everything he did. He divorced Octavia on false pretenses, then had her accused of crimes she had not committed, exiled to a desolate island, and finally put to death, sending the young, innocent, beloved woman to a brutal end so that he could be free. The people of Rome, who loved Octavia, were horrified. There were even demonstrations in her favor, but their anger changed nothing. Octavia died, and Nero married Poppaea. And Poppaea's end, when it came, was worse, and showed how little even those closest to him were safe. The story handed down is that Nero, in a fit of rage, while Poppaea was pregnant, struck or kicked her so violently that he killed her and the unborn child, and was then consumed with grief and remorse, mourning extravagantly the wife he had murdered in a moment of temper. Whether it happened exactly so, the very fact that Romans believed it of him and found it entirely in character tells you what their emperor had become. A man of sudden, lethal rages, whose love was as dangerous as his hatred, in whose presence no one, not a rival, not a wife, not a friend, was ever truly safe. And one by one, the men who had once restrained him fell away, until there was no one left to check him at all. The honest old soldier Burrus, who had commanded the guard and steadied the early rain, died, some said by poison, with Nero's hand suspected, and that left Seneca, the philosopher, the tutor who had guided Nero from boyhood and tried, for years, to channel his impulses toward good government. But Seneca, watching his former pupil descend into murder and madness, and increasingly endangered by his own closeness to a paranoid tyrant, understood that his position had become impossible. He tried to withdraw from public life, to retire quietly, to give back the vast wealth he had accumulated, and simply disappear into private study. Nero would not fully let him go. In time, when a conspiracy against Nero was uncovered, Seneca was implicated. Whether truly involved or merely convenient to be rid of, no one is certain, and Nero ordered his old teacher to die. Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher who had spent his life writing about how a wise man should face death with calm, was now required to demonstrate it. He was commanded to take his own life, and he did so with the composure his philosophy preached, opening his veins and dying slowly and deliberately, discoursing to his friends as the blood drained from him, meeting his end with the dignity his murderous pupil had never learned. With Seneca gone, the last steadying hand was gone. The good years were a distant memory. There was no one left who could tell Nero no, and the empire was about to burn. It began on a hot summer night, among the shops crowded around the great racing arena at the heart of the city. A small fire of the kind that broke out often enough in Rome, where most people lived packed into rickety timber tenements stacked tight along narrow streets. But this fire caught the wind, and the wind drove it into the maze of wooden buildings, and it grew and spread, and within hours it had become a catastrophe beyond anything the city had ever known. The great fire of Rome burned for days. It raced through the crowded districts, leaping from building to building, roaring down the narrow streets faster than people could flee, feeding on the timber and the close-packed houses. Whole neighborhoods were consumed. The people fled in terror before the flames, clogging the streets, trampling one another, carrying what they could, many trapped and killed as the fire outran them or cut off their escape. It would burn, die down, and break out again. By the time it finally exhausted itself, after the better part of a week and more, much of Rome lay in smoking ruins. Of the 14 districts of the city, only a few escaped untouched. The rest were damaged or destroyed entirely. Countless people were dead, and a great mass of the population was left homeless, camped in the open amid the ashes of everything they had owned. And here we come to the single most famous story ever told about Nero, the image that has defined him for 2,000 years, the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned. The legend says that as the great fire consumed his city, Nero stood watching from a high vantage point, dressed in stage costume, lyre in hand, and sang a long song about the burning of the ancient city of Troy, that he looked out over the real catastrophe engulfing his own people, and saw in it nothing but a magnificent backdrop for his art, a spectacle to inspire a performance. Whether it is literally true, no one can say for certain. Some of the accounts report it as fact. Others say he was away from the city when the fire started and hurried back. What is beyond doubt is that the Romans believed it of him, that the story spread and stuck, because it captured something they knew to be true about their emperor, that he was a man so lost in his own vanity, so detached from the suffering of others, that the people could readily believe he had treated the agony of his burning city as theater. A ruler earns that kind of story. It does not attach itself to the innocent. In fairness to him, the records also say Nero did take real measures once the fire was raging and after, opening his gardens and public buildings to shelter the homeless, bringing in food, organizing relief, and afterward rebuilding the city with wider streets and better fire safeguards. But none of that could outrun the rumor that was already spreading through the ruined city. A far more dangerous rumor than that he had merely sung while it burned. People were beginning to whisper that the emperor had not just watched the fire. They whispered that he had started it. The whisper had a logic to it that terrified Nero because of what he did next with the burned land. In the very heart of the devastated city, on a vast tract cleared by the flames, Nero began to build himself a pleasure palace of staggering, almost unbelievable extravagance. A sprawling complex of gardens, woods, and pavilions with an artificial lake at its center. The rooms sheathed in gold and gems and ivory, ceilings that showered flowers and perfume on his guests, and at its entrance, a colossal bronze statue of himself over 100 feet high. He called it his golden house, and it swallowed a huge swath of the city center for the private paradise of one man. To Romans picking through the ashes of their homes, it looked damning. The fire had conveniently cleared exactly the ground the emperor wanted for his palace. The suspicion hardened that Nero had burned his own city to build his dream house on the rubble. Nero needed that suspicion to land on someone else, fast, and he found his scapegoat in a small, obscure, and unpopular new religious sect, a group most Romans regarded with suspicion and contempt: the early Christians. Nero accused them of starting the fire and unleashed against them the first great persecution in their history, and it was savage beyond description. They were rounded up and put to death in ways calculated to double as public spectacle, torn apart by dogs in the arena, crucified, and most horribly, some were covered in pitch and set alight to burn as living torches to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. It was cruelty as entertainment, atrocity staged as a show. Roman writers themselves, no friends of the Christians, recorded that the savagery was so extreme that even a hostile public began to feel pity for the victims, sensing that they were being destroyed not for any real crime, but to feed one man's need for a scapegoat. By tradition, it was in this persecution that two of the most important early Christian leaders met their deaths in Rome. Nero had taken the catastrophe of his burning city and answered it with an atrocity, deflecting blame onto the innocent and drowning his own guilt, real or rumored, in their blood. The Golden House rose over the ashes, and it became the perfect monument to everything Nero had become. While his people rebuilt their lives in the burned districts, the emperor walked through his miles of private gardens and gilded halls, his enormous lake, his groves stocked with wild animals, and gazed up at the towering bronze giant he had made in his own image. When the palace was finished, the story goes, he remarked with satisfaction that he could at last begin to live like a human being, as if the wealth of the world poured into one man's pleasure palace were merely the bare minimum a person of his greatness deserved. It was megalomania made architecture. A single man consuming the heart of the world's greatest city for his private playground, while that city's people huddled in the ruins around its walls. Nothing he ever did displayed more nakedly how completely he had lost any sense of himself as a servant of his people, and how totally he had come to see the entire empire as a stage and a treasury for his own glory. But an empire is not a theater, and its people are not a captive audience who can be locked in their seats forever. Out beyond the gilded walls of the Golden House, beyond the reach of the paid applause, the patience of the Roman world was finally running out. The provinces were stirring. The armies were watching. The Senate seethed with men who had lost friends and family to Nero's executions and lived in daily fear of being next. The bubble of flattery that Nero had sealed himself inside was about to burst, all at once, and the man who had murdered and burned and performed his way through 14 years of absolute power was about to discover how quickly the whole thing could collapse and how very alone he truly was. The first great crack came from within, a conspiracy among the men closest to the throne. A wide circle of senators, officials, and army officers, sickened by Nero's cruelty and afraid for their own lives, secretly plotted to assassinate him and replace him with one of their own, a respected nobleman. For a time, the plot grew, drawing in more and more of Rome's leading men. And then, on the very eve of the attempt, it was betrayed, given away. The story goes, by a careless word and a frightened servant, and the whole conspiracy unraveled in Nero's hands. What followed was a bloodbath of suspicion. Nero, terrified to discover how many of his own circle had wanted him dead, lashed out in every direction. The conspirators were hunted down and forced to die, and then the killing widened, as it always does with a frightened tyrant, sweeping up not just the guilty, but the merely suspected, the inconvenient, the resented, anyone whose loyalty Nero had reason to doubt. Senators, officers, and famous men were ordered to open their veins, one after another. It was in this wave of terror that the philosopher Seneca was swept away. The discovery that he was hated and hunted did not chasten Nero. It unleashed him, and Rome's aristocracy entered a reign of fear in which a summons from the emperor, a softly delivered command to take one's own life, could come for anyone at any time on any pretext or none. The last years of Nero's reign were the years of a man unraveling. Drowning in suspicion, he saw enemies everywhere and struck down anyone who rose too high, achieved too much, or simply commanded too much respect. Because to a paranoid tyrant, distinction itself is a threat. Successful generals, distinguished senators, men of old and honored families were destroyed for no greater crime than being eminent enough to imagine on the throne. Wealth became dangerous because the emperor, having drained the treasury on his pleasures and his palace, eyed the fortunes of the rich and found it convenient to condemn them and seize their estates. Old friends, loyal servants, anyone who had ever seen too much, none were safe. The court became a place of whispered terror, where men watched their words and their faces, where informers prospered, where survival meant flattering a dangerous and unstable man while praying his eye did not fall on you next. And all the while, Nero remained lost in his fantasy of artistic greatness, touring the provinces to perform and compete, collecting his thousands of rigged victories, neglecting the hard work of actually ruling an empire that was beginning to come apart at the edges. He had emptied the treasury. He had alienated the Senate, the aristocracy, and the army. He had murdered or terrified nearly everyone of importance. He had become a man surrounded by enemies of his own making, propped up by nothing but the habit of obedience and the fear of his name. And habits and fear, when a ruler has given people nothing else, do not hold for long. The end, when it came fast. Out in the provinces, the men who commanded Rome's legions had had enough. A governor in Gaul rose in revolt, and though that first rising was put down, it lit the fuse. In Spain, a respected old general named Galba was proclaimed emperor by his troops, and the revolt spread. And the crucial thing, the fatal thing for Nero, was what did not happen. No one rallied to defend him. The armies would not march for him. The Senate would not stand by him. The people, hungry and taxed, and weary of his cruelty and his vanity, would not rise for him. 14 years of murder and extravagance and contempt had spent every reserve of loyalty he might have drawn on. And when the moment of crisis came, the master of the world discovered that he was utterly alone. The Senate found its courage at last and declared him a public enemy. condemning him to a humiliating public execution, and the guard that should have protected him melted away, bought off or simply unwilling to die for him. Nero woke one night in his palace to find the guards gone, the palace emptying, his friends and servants fled, the city slipping out of his hands. He sent for help, and none came. He went looking for someone, anyone, to stand with him, and found locked doors and empty rooms. The man who had ruled the world, who had filled theaters with forced applause and gardens with burning victims, was abandoned by every living soul, alone in his golden palace, with the news that the Senate had condemned him to die under the lash. A handful of loyal freedmen helped him slip out of the city to a villa in the countryside, where he hid, knowing the riders sent to seize him were already on the roads. And there, in those final hours, the full theatrical self-pity of the man poured out. He wept and lamented, and could not bring himself to do the deed. He is remembered for a single line, spoken over and over in those last hours as he contemplated his own end, a line that captures the whole tragic absurdity of him, a man facing the ruin of an empire and able to mourn above all the loss of his own imagined genius. "What an artist," he cried, "dies in me. Not what an emperor, not what a ruler. An artist to the very end, lost in the fantasy of his own brilliance." When at last he heard the hoofbeats of the riders coming to drag him to his public execution, he finally found the resolve, with a servant's help, to drive a blade into his own throat. So died Nero, around 30 years old, abandoned, alone, in a borrowed villa outside the city he had ruled and burned and terrorized. His death did not bring peace. It brought chaos. Nero was the last of his line, the final ruler descended from the founders of the empire, the end of the dynasty that traced back to the first emperor. He left no heir, and his fall tore open a question that had never been tested. If not his family, then who had the right to rule Rome? The answer, it turned out, was whoever could seize it by force. In the year after Nero's death, the empire convulsed as one general after another grabbed for the throne. 4 men claimed the title of emperor in a single bloody year, armies marching on Rome, the world that Nero's recklessness had destabilized tearing at itself, until at last a hard, capable commander fought his way to power and founded a new dynasty. The empire survived, but it had been shaken to its roots by the long misrule and violent fall of one vain and dangerous man. As for Nero himself, the Senate condemned his memory, and his statues were torn down, and his name was scratched from monuments across the empire. His golden house, that monument to his megalomania, was an embarrassment his successors could not wait to erase. They stripped it, filled it in, and buried it, and built public works for the people on top of it, deliberately giving back to Rome the heart of the city that Nero had taken for himself. The colossal statue of him remained, but later emperors reworked its face into the image of a god, erasing Nero even from his own giant. The world he had treated as his stage and his treasury closed over him and did its best to forget him, and remembered him when it did exactly as he had earned. As a byword for tyranny, vanity, and a mind with absolute power and no limits left, rotted at last into madness and ruin. Let it all settle now into the dark and grow quiet and drift away. The marble city and the menace beneath it, the poison at the banquet and the ship that came apart in the night, the locked theaters and the forced applause, the fire racing through the streets, and the golden palace rising over the ashes, and the colossus with its borrowed face, the abandoned man weeping in a borrowed villa over the artist the world was losing. Let all of it grow soft and far away, 2,000 years deep, and let the long, unhappy story close. You don't have to carry any of it. The fires burned out long ago. The tyrant is dust. The city he terrorized rebuilt itself and forgot him, and there is nothing in any of it that can reach you now here in the quiet and the dark. So let the marble blur and fade, and let yourself sink down out of all that noise and fear into the deep, still calm beneath it, where there are no tyrants and no terrors, and nothing at all that needs you tonight. Rest now. The long-dead emperor is gone, and the night is your own. And when the dark comes down again, I'll be here to carry you off to another time long ago, while the wonder of it still stands. Sleep well.